Do you feel like you keep attracting abusive people? So many times people come up to me and say, I'm bloody a narcissist magnet, or I'm an abusive person magnet. And if you feel this way, there's a whole element of truth to this situation. And isn't it absolutely terrifying and horrible when you feel like, okay, I attract them. What is it about this horrible situation that I'm attracted to, and B, that attracts these horrible people? Because what this does is it leaves you fearful to drive forward. But the reality is we start looking at this situation. There's a couple of points I want to dig into. If you are fearful about moving forward and choosing the wrong person because you believe you attract toxicity, well, then what's really going on here is there's an element where you go, I've lost trust in myself. And as a consequence of losing trust in myself, trust to make the right decision, trust to represent myself, trust to speak my truth, then as a consequence of that, I live in fear. And when I get into relationships, it is better to stand back than to get in, because we don't know what direction it's going to go in. But your experience tells you that it ain't going to be good. And you don't want to get hurt again. And more importantly, your self-worth, your intuition is saying, I really don't want to experience that again. I don't know how much more I can cop. So let's dig into what's going on. So grooming has a significant role in what attracts abusive people to you. Not by them, but by people from your past. So let's dig into that a little bit. Now, I want to open this up by saying I am not saying that I'm not talking about whether parents are good parents or bad parents. All right, I want to park that for now. There's some obviously horrific parents out there, and as a consequence of their narcissistic abusive behavior, of course, you're going to be, as the child growing up in that environment, you're going to be groomed in this negative way that I'm going to talk about. But it's not only from abusive, bad people. You can be groomed from incredible people within your world. Like, your parents might love you with absolutely everything they have. And as a consequence for that love for you and for their desire for you to grow into the best version of you, they really controlled a lot of your existence. They controlled it because they loved you. They controlled it because they wanted to protect you. They controlled you because they wanted to guide you and mentor you and coach you into the best version of you that they wanted for you. And as a consequence of that, you can be groomed for future relationship. Because where is your reference points coming from in relationship? Most of the time, the reference point is coming from your past relationships. Your number one relationship in your life are those that you grew up with between the ages of 0 and 6, between the ages of 7 and 13, where acceptance and connection was absolutely key. Where we were learning what to accept, how to accept, when we were learning reference points for what is love, what is good behavior. What does a relationship look like? What does a husband, what does a wife look like? What are the roles within those relationships? That's our reference point. As we move on through the ages, and we get to the ages of from 13 or 14 to 20, this is where we're trying to find our own identity. It's around significance and achievement. And in those times when you're heavily groomed, when you hit adolescence and your intuition is guiding you one way, but the controlling parent is trying to take you another way, a few things happen. And I'm going to run through a few of those things because you'll see how this plays out in future relationships. And let's see if this resonates with you. So, grooming, what is it? It's not just, a term reserved for, an older person trying to groom a younger person, or a wiser person or a richer person trying to groom a younger person in order to, sexually abuse them, all those sorts of things. That's where it's quite often known. But grooming is literally, we bring people into organizations and we groom them to fit different roles. Well, in a family dynamic, you're groomed to fit a particular role. So groomed is to be made for use and service. For use and service within the role that they want you to fulfill. Now, your parents might have had the best intention, they might have had shitty intention, the same outcomes happens. You become prepared for use and service. Now, when you're prepared for use and service, and that is then handed to an abusive person, someone that lacks character, integrity, compassion, empathy, someone that manipulates, coerced, someone that is narcissistic, then this is a recipe for absolute disaster. Another thing that you're groomed to do is to fight for love, to fight for affirmation of a job well done. You see, as we're growing up through these years, we get rewarded when we do the things that our parents think are good. And we get chastised and disciplined and often psychologically manipulated, through reverse psychology and all those sorts of things for things that they don't approve of. So in this space, yes, we can learn a lot of good, but we can also pick up on some really terrible belief systems that don't serve you. Then once we learn what is good and what is bad, what do we then do? You see, as kids, we want to please. So we're starting to introduce people pleasing here. And the reality is, when we want to please, what do we do to please? We repeat the behaviors that we get positively rewarded for. Can you see where this is going? When this plays out in your adult relationships and you're with a toxic person, that is exactly what they want. When they tell you, when they, make you feel bad to do one thing and good to do another thing, and you want their love, you'll do the thing that they want you to do that is good, that gets the reward that they're going to issue. This is what we're getting groomed for. So we end up repeating those behaviors for positive reinforcement. We also get groomed to avoid confrontation, because there's nothing worse when you come home, to the family home, and you want to speak your mind, you want to speak your truth. And your truth is not going to be accepted by that person that's controlling you. So sometimes it's easier to keep it in. And this is what we learn to do in relationship. It's to avoid that confrontation. But you see, in great relationships, we need to constantly speak our truth, because we have to represent us. We have to represent our intuition and our thoughts and our wants and desires. And if we don't do that, we know the result. We get absolutely walked over. Why? Because what grooming does is to teach us to yield, to submit our will to the controlling or manipulative person, to surrender our will, to surrender our wants, to surrender our desires for someone else. And without question, every single time we do that, there's a snowball effect that goes through. Because when you don't represent you lose trust in you. If you're in a relationship and you get into a situation and your partner doesn't back you, you lose trust in them in a situation moving forward, where the same thing happens to you. When they do that, you lose respect in them, and the same thing happens to you. You see less value in them. The same thing happens to you, which is your self-worth. And self-worth is not the opinion of yourself. Sure, that forms part of it. But holistically, it's action. It's how you represent yourself that is self-worth. Do you speak your truth with peaceful confidence? Can you say no without guilt and shame? Right? These are the type of things that represent us. But when we're groomed, we tend not to do that. In fact, we're rewarded when we don't. We use denial to avoid the reality. Well, once we start doing that, denial starts feeding into trauma bonds. So we get prepared for use and service, right? So we fight for their love bombing. Love bombing, is to mimic the words, actions, and behaviors of love. It's not real, it's mimicking so they can control us. They then gaslight us, make us question our own thoughts, our own realities, our own perceptions. So we doubt ourselves, but that's too painful to bear, so we deny. We deny the situation, and in fact, we make excuses for the other person. And this is so detrimental to our self-worth. So when we get into that denial stage, what do? We seek positive affirmation again, and that completes the trauma bond of addiction, because the dopamine will get released as soon as we try and fight for that affirmation and they give it to us. But it also releases serotonin, which connects us through love to the abusive person, and we become addicted, trauma bonded based on that denial. And this is all part of the grooming process. So it's one of those things that we have to be aware of what we've gone through in the past. But there's another kicker to this. When we're raised in these sorts of environments, what we're actually taught to do is to withstand. Why is it that when we get in these abusive relationships, we can't get out? Why is it that we see so much good in them? In other words, we're seeing the potential in a person that is not being realized. It's not being demonstrated in action. We can see what they could be. And based on that, based on the denial, based on the love bombing, based on the fact that we no longer trust ourselves, based on the gaslighting where we doubt everything that we do, we withstand the abuse. And this is what happens. So when we start looking at our past, when we start looking about, the environment that we grew up in, and we start looking at the relationships that we've had, it starts making sense as to why we attract abusive people. It's because you're incredible, beautiful, compassionate, empathetic, loving, loyal, committed people. And an abusive person needs all of that. So how do we create shift? We recognize that could be us, and we're looking at it going, oh, well, now I'm fucked. And we don't want you to feel that way. The reality is, it's like, no, we can definitely create shift. So now we know what is going on. Now we know some of the belief systems that no longer serve us. It's about shifting perspective. And there's a whole process we can take you through to shift that perspective. But you've got to start loving you. You've got to start identifying with who you actually are. You need to tune in to your intuition and live with integrity. So in other words, to represent you the way you would a loved one. You see, when you rebuild self-worth, when you know your identity, when you know how to set, manage, and maintain your boundaries, how to speak your truth with peaceful confidence, how to say no without guilt and shame, that's kryptonite to an abusive person. And you will no longer attract them. Why? Because there is no oxygen in the room that they can breathe. They can't breathe reality and truth. They can't breathe boundary management. They can't breathe you knowing your worth, because when you know that you are worthy of love and belonging from others, you will not stand, tolerate, put up with their bullshit. And we take back our power. So know your worth. Find out who you are. Speak your truth. Say no without guilt and shame. Represent you. Why? Because you're worth it. You're incredible. You're amazing. Stay strong.